So welcome everyone, I'm Pierre-Lune Bellec and it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the day. As you may or may not know, we have a long tradition of educational sessions at Maine. There is a full day on Friday dedicated to hands-on training, and Karim already gave you an overview of the program, but every day we're going to kickstart with an educational talk. So this morning our speaker is Dr. Elizabeth DuPre. Elizabeth has started working on advanced MRI method at Cornell University before moving to Montreal to do her PhD under the supervision of Jean-Baptiste Pauline, in which she studied methods to align different brains together. So at the core of her interest were measures of similarity of brain representation. After she graduated, she moved to Stanford University as a Hootsai postdoctoral fellow under the supervision of Russ Poldrack and Scott Lindman, in which she developed new statistical methods to better take into account inter-individual variability. So I guess we probably have one of the top world experts this morning to give us an overview of methodologies to measure similarities between neuronal representation across subjects and possibly bridging the gap between artificial and biological representations as well. So join me to welcome Dr. Elizabeth DuPre.
Merci. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pierre-Lune, for that really generous introduction. Let's see if I can get my slides. Thank you. Okay, perfect. So, hi, thank you so much everyone for being here today. Excuse me. I am so happy to be back at Maine. It's been a number of years for me, and this is always such a wonderful conference, so I'm so happy to be here, and especially to help kind of kickstart the energy in the room. As was mentioned, I'm actually back in Montreal. I've been in Silicon Valley for the past couple of years doing a postdoc at Stanford. And so I hope you'll forgive me that I want to start the talk with a very Silicon Valley anecdote. But I think it will extend to many people's experience, particularly if you thought about machine learning in kind of industry production settings. And I'm going to argue it's of really strong relevance for all of us in this room as well. So this is from Chip Hyun, who's talked a lot about machine learning in industry, and she gives this example. An executive comes to her and has said, you know, I really wanted to take an AI model and be able to deploy it to improve the way that I'm stocking my grocery stores, let's say. So I hired a consulting team, and they came up with this model, and it worked super well, so we put it in production, and everything was going great. Couple months pass, the model's doing well, and then all of a sudden, the engineers on the executives team start reporting that the model isn't performing quite as expected. The targets that they say to restock aren't making sense, so they have some products expiring on the shelves, but it's not too bad. You know, the engineers on the team are able to manually adjust some of the model parameters, they do some tweaks, they keep it in production. A couple more months go by, and the engineers come back to her and they tell her, actually, you know, this model just doesn't work anymore. And now we're actively losing money by using this model. So the executive, unfortunately, is now in a position where she has no good choices, right? She could rehire the consulting team. She could go find a new consulting team. But whatever she does, she's going to lose money and time. And I think that we in neuroscience, you know, we often are not thinking in this explicit space. But the problem that she encountered and the problem that we encounter, or we are starting to encounter more and more as a field, is fundamentally the same. And the problem is one of distribution shift. So what I'm going to argue today is why that's important for us, how we see that in our neural data, in our data sets, and provide a couple of different ways that folks, including myself, have started to think about how we can address this problem moving forward. All right, so you can have a model deployed in the real world, maybe telling you how to restock groceries that shows distribution shift, where the predictions change and how useful they are over time. But you can also have neural data that shows real and meaningful distribution shifts. So many of people may be familiar with this if you think about something like readouts from population of cells and how those can change over time. So this is a really beautiful example from Rule and colleagues where they have chronic implants in mice. measuring the same population of cells. And if you sort the cells on day 1, please forgive me while I find my pointer. If you sort the cells on day 1, what you can see is there's a really nice encoding of spatial position along the track. In this case, it's the T maze for the mouse, that is reflected in the cell patterns. Now, what's important is that if you resort the cells on different intervals over time, so on day 10 and day 20, you see that this relationship with spatial position is maintained. But if you were to only use the sorting from day 1, if you reuse it again at day 10 and at day 20, it appears that the relationship with spatial position is lost. So there's a shift that occurs over time within this neural population in terms of how spatial position is encoded. So the models developed at day 1 aren't necessarily useful at day 10 and day 20, right? And we can talk in great detail. There's a whole literature on this idea of representational drift. We can talk about why this happens and why it's interesting. That's not what I'm going to focus on today. I just want to point to the fact that it does happen. And, you know, maybe you say, okay, this is an interesting phenomenon. Maybe this tells us something about how the brain processes information or encodes information across populations of cells, but I don't really see how it's directly useful. And I just want to point out that many applications, particularly that we in the neuro AI space are excited about, like brain-computer interfaces, often we imagine that there is a consistent readout that we can rely on. And if we can't rely on that, it's going to challenge these applications. So, for example, this is a modified figure from Fan and colleagues where they have chronic implants of brain-computer interface from one patient to do handwriting BCI. And what you can see is they train a model using data at day 0 in this case, and the model performs quite well. You can see the character error rate at day 0 is quite low. The word error rate at day 0 is quite low. But then just to show the importance of recalibrating, the importance of accounting for this distribution shift, they retest the same model at every session for over a year. And what you can see is if you don't recalibrate the model, if you don't account for this distribution shift, at later sessions, you can get over 60% character encoding rate and over 90% word encoding rate, rendering this particular handwriting BCI effectively useless for the participant. And so accounting for distribution shifts in real data is very important. Now, my title promised you naturalistic neuroimaging because that's the space in which I sit. And you may think that I don't have to worry about this, right? I don't look at populations of cells. I don't look at chronic implants. I'm looking at non-invasive recordings, so maybe I don't have to think about distribution shifts at all. And I don't think about them in the same way, but I want to point to the fact that inter-individual comparisons also involve significant shifts in signal organization and the properties of the signal. So, this is a real challenge because if we want to make inferences across subjects, if we want to correct for batch effects, you may hear people say, we need to establish a mapping between neural activity patterns. And this is non-trivial. So this is an example figure from Alexis Toile and colleagues. And effectively what they're showing is these are 3 different individuals on their native surface meshes doing the same task. And you can see that there are definitely similarities, but there are also important differences. Here as I'm highlighting in sort of the anterior TPJ area. But what you can see is, for example, subject 4 isn't showing the same pattern of deactivation that subject 7 and subject 9 are showing, right? And so if we wanted to just directly compare these, say by averaging them, we would lose information, and it's also not clear how to map one to the other on a one-to-one level. So in neuroimaging, the strategy we use for a very long time, which works quite well in many cases, is that we take advantage of our knowledge of anatomy, right? So we're very lucky in that we're not just looking at populations of cells, we're actually looking at the whole brain at once, depending on your imaging protocol. And so we have access to information about the anatomy, and so normally what we would say is we can normalize to a standardized anatomical space. But we've known since at least the start of neuroimaging that it's not quite that simple. So here's just one example of why there's no one reference anatomy that we can normalize to. This is Heschel's gyrus. As you may have guessed from the name, in about 70% of the population, it's a single gyrus, but in the remaining 30%, you get some amount of duplication of the gyrus, up to a complete duplication. And so it's unclear how you would compare individuals with a complete duplication of the gyrus to only a single version of the gyrus, right? There's no one anatomy answer there. And so if we were to use kind of current best standard techniques for leveraging anatomy. So this is projecting those same participants I showed you from the result of Twell and colleagues onto FS average, this very high resolution anatomical mesh. You can see that some of this variability is partially accounted for, but it's certainly not all accounted for. Those individual specific differences persist. And if we actually look in the average, those individual specific differences are lost, right? So we're losing information when we don't account for this distribution shift, when we just try and combine the data without being careful with it, I would argue. So a lot of my work, a lot of the work that I want to talk to today focuses on this really, I would argue, fundamental question for neuro-AI in the sense of how do we make our models generalizable? And the question is, how can we recognize and compensate for shifts in across individuals, and over time in their neural activity patterns, whatever recording modality you happen to be using. I'm going to focus again on fMRI in my case. So to do that, I want to focus on three key ideas. First, I'm going to talk about measuring dissimilarity with metrics. This is often how people are most familiar with this topic, and I think it's really, really important to spend a bit of time on it because it's shown some really powerful things. I'm then going to talk about alignment as a rich alternative, so these specific techniques to directly address distribution shift rather than just measure it. And then I'm going to provide a few resources and recommendations for getting started because this would not be a didactic talk without those. And I hope that you can leave the room excited about some of these ideas. So first, let's talk about metrics. A fundamental idea is that if we want to effectively assess the amount of shift, if we want to quantify differences between individuals or task conditions or different models, let's say you have a biological model as well as an artificial model, what we typically want to do is find a metric we can use to measure their dissimilarity, to see really how similar or dissimilar are they. And the traditional way that this is done is using something like this. So many of you may look at a matrix like this and immediately think representational similarity analysis. Fundamentally, the idea is that you have a collection of stimuli and you're going to measure activity, neural activity, in response to each of these stimuli across your two different systems. Again, could be two people, could be two task conditions, could be two different artificial models. And then you're going to see, based on the evoked activity, what is the distance between these different matrices, these evoked matrices. So one problem that comes up is, I said many of you may think about representational similarity analysis, but that's not exactly a clear definition, right? When you say, I'm going to compare these two, there are many different kinds of comparisons you could make. There are many different ways two matrices could be similar, as there are as many different ways they could be different. If we think about it in terms of distributions, many different properties of the distribution could be shared, right? You could have the same mean, but very different variance, for example. And so which metric to use when we're actually making these similarity claims is highly data dependent, and currently field-specific norms is really what's guided their use or refined their use over time. And importantly, one thing that I really want to emphasize is that each metric is going to provide different insight into the structure of learned representation. So it's going to be very difficult to find a single metric that will tell you all of the possible information about how similar or dissimilar two different series of activations are. So here's just an example from a paper a few years ago from Simon Kornblith and colleagues, where they introduced a new metric at the time called centered kernel alignment. And what I want to show you is that for these, this is on the y-axis versus the x-axis, this is two different initializations of the same network. So same architecture, same training regime, it's just different initializations. So what you would expect is that the similarity metric should be highest along the diagonal. You should expect each layer to be most similar to itself across the different initializations. And they're making an argument in this paper, of course, for their particular centered kernel alignment. It's a lovely metric. But what I want to point out in this figure is really the amount of variability that you see across metrics. So it's not as if we could say, looking at CCA, which is canonical correlation analysis, versus linear regression versus CKA. Oh yes, we clearly get all the same information for these three metrics. Each of them is providing us with different insights, and that's really important when you try and go and use these metrics to make comparisons, to account for these, or measure, quantify these differences between activations and individuals. And so, I want to point to metrics because I think they've been so meaningful for the field. I think this is something that, there's so much work going on right now. I'm including, excuse me, I'm including a picture of statistical shape analysis because I think that, there's a really rich mathematical body of literature that we as a field in NeuroAI have just started to tap into in terms of leveraging metrics that have really formalized mathematical properties that we can make inferences on and carry forward. And I think we should continue to do that. I think that work will continue to be really important. But I also think it's equally important for us to continue to remember that one of the reasons we need this is because if we're just going to come up with a number to enable us to do, for example, model selection, when we compare many, many different models, we need to be aware of what that number is exactly telling us and that it can't tell us the whole story. Right? So maybe we need multiple numbers, maybe we need different numbers, but this is something we should be thinking really carefully about. And I think as we continue as a field to think carefully about this, to come up with true metrics in the mathematical sense, leveraging these can allow us to decrease the distance or dissimilarity between systems and start to think about how we can combine data sets in a way that mitigates distributional shifts, which continue to prove important. And on that note, I just want to show one thing, which is that if you think about this original perspective, there was recently a really nice paper from Harvey, Larson, Alex Williams and colleagues at the UNIREPS workshop, where they actually showed that particular mathematical techniques within this framework of comparing similarity matrices actually are mathematically analogous to these statistical shape-based techniques, which I think are really motivating for a lot of the alignment work. This is kind of the history of the alignment work that we're drawing on. So seeing these really deep connections, I think, is powerful, and I think only encourages us to look carefully at the kinds of metrics we're using and what they can say. Awesome. Okay, so I now want to propose that we have these metrics. They enable us to get some amount of insight onto, how different or dissimilar are these systems. But I would argue that the next step is effectively to say, okay, maybe I'm aware of some amount of distributional shift or dissimilarity that's occurred between my two systems of interest, between two individuals, two neural recordings, an artificial and a biological neural network. How can I actually leverage this information to try and make them more similar, to try and do generalizable inferences across them? And what I would argue is that alignment techniques, this broad category, provides a really rich space in which to think about this problem. So the goal is, much as you saw in that shape-based thing, rather than simply measuring the distance, we can actually bring data into the same space. And by having it in the same space, we can jointly analyze some aspect of it, right? So importantly, much as for metrics, there are many, many, many different ways this can be done. And assessing the right way depends a lot on your application. So this can be done, for example, in a higher low dimensional space. You can keep all the data, or you can do a data dimensionality reduction to start. It can be done using labeled or unlabeled experimental data. So you can know the correspondence between points, or you cannot know the correspondence between points, given your particular techniques, right? And each of these properties are going to afford you slightly different things about the kinds of transformations you can learn. But importantly, I think these alignments can be reused in new data. So I think this is a really critical question for when we're targeting distribution shifts, when we're targeting creating generalizable models of cognition, the brain. We want to see how far they can extend. Can they extend to new stimuli? So I, for example, working in naturalistic stimuli, I think one of the reasons that's so powerful is there are many, many different ways you can annotate it. There are many, many different features that you can take advantage of. And seeing how well these properties generalize across feature sets, I think gives us a lot more insight into maybe how the brain uses them, but also how useful are they generally. Okay, so as I mentioned, much is for metrics. Given that there's a variety of alignment methods out there right now, which method to choose is data dependent in terms of the particular signal characteristics you have, and currently largely guided by field norms. So we, a few years ago, Thomas Bazet, Jean-Baptiste Pauline, Bertrand Thirion, and I, and Hugo Richat, we went through and we started to see for fMRI data, could we systematically evaluate the alignment methods that to that point had been proposed and see how they affected performance. And so here, what we decided to do was to do intersubject decoding accuracy on unrelated downstream decoding tasks. The idea being that if indeed we're making individuals more comparable, we should be able to take a new individual, learn a transformation, and then bring them in and make them more comparable as well, right? So we should improve our decoding accuracy because we're mitigating the cross-individual distribution shift. And that's what we found. So here what you can see is we have a variety of data sets, all colored in different dots. Every dot is a different cross-validation fold, so a different participant from a given data set. 0 is if we did no functional alignment, we just did field standard anatomical alignment. And then what we're showing is improvement in intersubject decoding accuracy using, I've shown you here the two best performing methods, one of which, the shared response model, is a low dimensional method. For those who may be familiar with probabilistic PCA, roughly analogous to that, but in fMRI with some fMRI tweaks. And then a high dimensional optimal transport method. And so just to give you a sense of the scale, at the time, we also ran an analysis to see if we just did intersubject decoding, if we just learned these models within the subject and didn't include any other subject data, how much better do we do in subject than across subjects? And that's about, just under 10%. So we concluded we were pretty happy at the time to see that these methods recovered about half of the signal normally lost to intersubject variability we could regain through these kinds of alignments. And we wanted to see, does this distort the signal or does it maintain meaningful structure that can actually be analyzed? And we were really encouraged at the time to see again that these could actually be analyzed and evaluated. So this was all really good news for us. What's even better news is that in the years since, there's been a lot more work in this direction, in particular using optimal transport methods. So this is a recent result, again, from Alexis Toile and colleagues. And here what they're showing is, in fact, that if you use an improved optimal transport-based method to account for these inter-individual distribution shifts, if you compare the alignment only learned on a subject to alignments only learned on different subjects and tested on that test subject, you see that, of course, learning the model in the subject does better. You don't have to account for changes in the distribution. You can just fit to the signal that you have. However, if you do an alignment, you can see a 75% improvement in decoding accuracy right away, just by learning the model on the aligned subjects, testing it on the held out subject that you've tried to align to. And then what you can see even more strikingly is that if you learn the model on multiple subjects, you can get accuracy that is much closer or even meets within subject accuracy as if you had just learned the model within the subject, but you need way less data. So we can take advantage of the data that we have. We don't necessarily need these very, very long data sets to get really impressive results. And again, that's because we're leveraging cross-subject data very carefully. We're thinking about these distribution shifts really proactively. And so I think these have made a big difference in how we can make inferences in this space. The other thing I want to point to here is that for those who, like me, are very interested in methods for analyzing neural data broadly, these alignment methods can coexist within many other frameworks. So in my postdoctoral work at Stanford, we started to think about Bayesian change point analysis. For those who are not familiar, change point analysis is maybe a canonical way to think about distribution shifts in continuous signals, because the basic idea is you have some continuous signal, To go back to an industry example, let's say a financial market, right? So you have some signal that's coming in, or maybe it's your BCI, and you have some property of the signal that changes. Maybe you see a jump in the mean or a jump in the variance, and you can call that a change point, and then consider that there's been some shift in the generative parameters that's leading to this shift in distribution that you can then, adapt your model and move along. If, for example, our executive in the beginning had a Bayesian change point analysis, they might have been able to deal with the problem a lot sooner rather than 6 months down the road with a new consulting team. So we were really interested in this particular method to start looking at distribution shifts because it allows us really nicely to build these hierarchical models to think about the generative process through which we could actually look at distribution shifts and learn alignments within them to better enable us to leverage the data that we have versus trying to fit models under idealized data. Okay, so I do want to provide a few resources because I think that, this space is really quite large. There's a lot happening, and it can be really hard to orient yourself, especially if you're thinking, for those who are familiar, just with the metrics literature, that it seems like there's a new metric all the time. It seems like there's a new alignment method all the time. So how can you get started? How can you start thinking about this with your own data? So first, I would give some decision points that I think everyone should be aware of and considerations that I think are important. One of which is that you really do want to choose the right feature space, right? So whatever your particular data modality of interest is, if you can control the kinds of features that you're supplying to the model, that's going to make a really big difference. So for example, if you're going to do a decomposition, being really careful about how you combine that with your data. Or if you're going to design a particular task, right? Making sure that the task is going to sample the property that you're interested in. So if I am interested in visual cortex, but I only do a music listening task, it's not going to give me enough information to really form the distribution that I'm interested in. Similarly, if you're going to try and do alignments between different systems, one of the things to think about is how much correspondence do you really expect between those two systems? Do I really expect all information to carry from one system to another? This could be two different people, which I'll give an example of in a second. This could be for those working strictly with artificial systems, from a fully trained network to a pruned trained network, right? Do I really expect a one-to-one mapping between those? I think that notion of similarity is also really important. But first I want to talk about the feature space. So there are two things I point to here, but I think, generally you could think about this as, am I sampling the distribution in the way that I'm going to get the information that I need? So for example, if you are going to learn a low dimensional alignment, if you do a PCA, for example, let's say, and you only take one component, is that going to give you enough information? Maybe if you think that there's a very clear shift between the distributions, but at least in my experience with fMRI, that almost never happens. There's usually a lot more information in the signal, which is a wonderful problem to have in neural data, as we so often do. But we just have to be really careful about how we leverage the information in this signal, right? So being really careful about the selective feature subspace, being really careful about the kinds of tasks that you're doing. Again, with the audio only paradigm to interest in visual cortex example, right? So if you have very different data characteristics where you're learning these alignments, you just don't sample enough of the distribution to be able to make a transformation. It's not going to enable you to generalize downstream to things you would like to generalize to, at least in my hands to date. But I think that, as more people get into this space, it is worth thinking about really, really carefully for how we can do this effectively and providing guidelines for the field. But for now, I would say try and make sure that whatever your downstream use case is, which I would always encourage you to have in mind when you start this, that it aligns with the data that's going in. The other thing I want to point to, and that I think has been really interesting in the past couple of years in terms of both metric development and also alignment development, is unbalancing. So this is that first paper from Alexei Toile I mentioned, but this is just showing the impact of unbalancing, right? So effectively, in some cases, perhaps in many cases, in biological systems, in artificial systems under different training regimes or architectures, or particularly if you want to go and compare a human brain with an artificial brain, then the question is, do I really expect all the information to be conserved across both? And so, allowing for some amount of unbalancing or allowing information to degrade may help you to cope with this. Here, this example is showing effectively, let's see if I can do this pointer. Nice, okay. So here, this example, this is still better, is showing that for two individuals, even though they have activation in roughly the similar place by visual inspection, what you can actually see is that they're not exactly the same amount of information, right? So in this case, this is an optimal transport framework that's used for this particular alignment. So we allow some of it's called mass to degrade and transport. We basically say, I don't expect all of the information from one individual to perfectly map to all of the information in the other individual. And so if some of it only belongs to one, that's totally fine. And we can actually quantify how much that's true. And that, I think, tells us useful and interesting information, but designing our alignments to allow us to do this, I think, is really, really important to account for distribution shifts that we know and expect between individuals and systems. And so, yeah, this is just to show that unbalancing the alignment can allow for this unmatched information to be discarded during the alignment, but in a principled way, where we know where it went, where we know how much was transferred or not, and maybe that's something we'd be interested in analyzing down the line to really evaluate how dissimilar these particular, in this case, individuals are. All right, so those are two considerations that I would encourage you to keep in mind: choosing the feature space, thinking about, unbalancing when you're going between disparate systems, or even, as we just showed you, between different individuals. I wanted to provide some recommendations as well for getting started. First, I do think it's really critical at this point to consider how you evaluate the success of alignment in your data. So our executive at the beginning had sales, right? That was a really easy and clear metric. We in NeuroAI are not so privileged to have an immediate number to think of right away. But I think, when we leverage these techniques, thinking about our metrics, thinking about our measures of outcome, provide us with a really strong framework to be able to assess how well we're actually doing in capturing similarity or dissimilarity. The examples I've showed you have largely relied on decoding. I'm a big fan of predictive methods in general, but I think there are many, many different ways to do this. The other thing I would say is, of course, this is always true, to look for literature in your field to see what alignment methods have been applied to your data modality, because again, currently, these are still being actively developed. Many of them are adapted for different kinds of signals. All neural data and much artificial data have very different signal properties. So just looking to see what's being done is really, really useful. And finally, evaluate if your application is likely to have unbalanced information between source and target data sets. I would say that this is increasingly common, we're realizing, but choose alignment methods accordingly, right? Depending on what you're trying to do, think about how you want information to be transferred and how you'll measure when it's not. I also wanted to provide a couple of resources for getting started. So fMR Align is something that I've been very happy to contribute to, along with many others, some of who are in the room, like Pierre-Louis Barbarin. Neuralign from Eva Dyer's group, NetRep from Alex Williams' group, which provides a really beautiful catalog of many different metrics that people can apply to their data. And I think all of these packages, this is a really actively developing space. There's a lot of work going on here. And there are many that I haven't listed here. But if you're working on something in this space, I would absolutely love to hear it, because I think it's going to take a lot more work in this for all of us to come up with new field standards. But it's really critically important for these big problems. So in conclusion, I just want to leave you with one more motivation, in addition to our executive, about why this might be important, right? So as a field, we in neuroimaging, and I would argue this is true in systems neuroscience as well, I've talked to many folks there, we're increasingly having access to more and more data. So in naturalistic neuroimaging, this has taken the form of a move from big data to deep data, where we have increasing access to data sets that include extensive sampling from a small number of individuals. In other efforts in systems neuroscience, for example, IBL, the International Brain Laboratory, you have many, many different groups that have come together to coordinate protocols so they can collect these really large data sets in animal work. And I think all of this has shown us that, you know, we're getting these data sets that are really so beautiful, and we really want to take full advantage of them. But to do that will require reckoning with many different sources of distribution shift, different sites, different individuals, different protocols, different stimuli, right? And I saw on the schedule there's going to be a session about neural foundation models, which I'm very excited about. But I think as we start to think about moving towards something like that, where we're training on all of this data, reckoning with these sources of distribution shift through alignment methods, understanding them through metrics is going to serve us very, very well to be able to leverage this data in a really compelling way and draw generalizable inferences across all of them. So with that, I would like to conclude. I'd like to thank Courtois Neuromod, the SimXP Lab. I'd also like to thank my advisors at Stanford, Russ Poldrak and Scott Linderman, and thank you all for your attention.